In this lecture, we're going to focus on the uterine cycle. The uterine cycle has three different phases to it. It has menses, which results in menstrual discharge or bleeding that happens roughly every 28 days in females. Keep in mind that's highly variable. Proliferative phase, and then the secretory phase. And we're going to talk about all of those in detail. One thing I want to point out is that there are two cycles specific to female reproductive biology. There is a uterine cycle, which we're going to talk about in this lecture, and there's also an ovarian cycle. They are intimately related to each other. There's hormones released from the ovaries during the ovarian cycle that stimulate or regulate the uterine cycle, but they are two separate events. So to be clear, the goal of the uterine cycle is to get the endometrium ready for implantation of a fertilized egg and the resulting pregnancy. If that's not going to occur, then we're going to have menses, and the cycle is going to happen again and again and again in reproductively mature females every 28 days. This is a picture of the uterus, which we looked at last video. This blue line right here represents the endometrium. Once again, this is the myometrium, and that is the perimetrium. There are two layers to the endometrium. The stratum basalis, which is the outermost layer, and the stratum functionalis, which is the innermost layer. And this would apply to all of this blue region right here, not necessarily up here in the fallopian tubes, but lining the womb, if you will, is the endometrium that's made up of this outer line, which is the stratum basalis, and the innermost line, which is the stratum functionalis. The stratum functionalis is what sheds off every 28 days. There are also going to be some arteries that penetrate into the endometrium from the myometrium, and these are known as spiral arteries. And we'll talk about those as we move forward. But in short, we can look at the uterine cycle like this. The first 5 days, and keep in mind when I'm talking about days, this is highly variable. There are some individuals that may have a uterine cycle that is regularly every 25 days. There might be others that's every 20 days. But in general, we talk about the cycle being every 28 days. The first roughly 5 days is menses, and that's the shedding off of the stratum functionalis. The proliferative phase is the rebuilding of the stratum functionalis. So please keep in mind, if menses occurs, that means fertilization of an egg which has been ovulated has not occurred. The proliferative phase rebuilds the stratum functionalis via mitotic activity under the influence of a number of hormones, but we'll just stick with estrogen for now. So estrogen stimulates the rebuilding of the stratum functionalis via mitotic activity. Estrogen is being released from the ovary. The secretory phase, which is stimulated by another hormone known as progesterone, which is released by a structure within the ovaries known as the corpus luteum. During the secretory phase and during increased levels of progesterone, we get a glycogen-rich secretion building up within the endometrium. And we need glycogen-rich secretions within the endometrium to provide nutrition to the developing embryo. So once again, menses is shedding off of the stratum functionalis. Proliferative phase is a mitotic activity to rebuild the stratum functionalis. And the secretory phase is the development of glycogen-rich secretions in the endometrium, specifically in the stratum functionalis, in anticipation of a fertilized egg implanting on the endometrium. If a fertilized egg does not implant on the endometrium at roughly day 28, we get menses again, which is a shedding of the stratum functionalis over roughly 5 days. Another proliferative phase to rebuild the stratum functionalis via mitotic activity, the buildup of glycogen-rich secretions during the secretory phase. And this goes on and on and on. At roughly day 28, we get a sharp decline in hormones in both estrogen and mainly progesterone. which causes those spiral arteries that I talked about that come into the endometrium from the myometrium to become spasmatic and vasoconstrict. When blood vessels vasoconstrict, they diminish blood flow to a specific area. When blood flow is diminished to an area, there is low oxygen delivery to that tissue, known as ischemia. And if the tissues don't have adequate oxygen, they degenerate. And in this case, the stratum functionalis will degenerate due to lack of oxygen, and then it will slough off, causing menses. Throwing one more thing into this slide right here, and that is ovulation. I want to be very clear. Ovulation is not part of the uterine cycle. Ovulation is merely the release of an egg from an ovary. So there's an ovarian cycle where there's the development of ovarian follicles and the egg within those follicles that culminates in ovulation. So if we were to start the ovarian cycle here, day 1, ovulation is going to occur on day 28 of the ovarian cycle. And ovulation corresponds to day 14 or 15 of the uterine cycle. And that's what we see right here. And this is the basis of what's known as one form of birth control known as the rhythm method. That is to say, individuals will count from the first day of menses, roughly 14 days, as one method of determining when ovulation is occurring. There's other ways to determine it. Please don't use this method because it's not a foolproof way of avoiding pregnancy. But the whole idea here is that ovulation occurs roughly 14 days after the beginning of menses. The other way of saying it, ovulation occurs right at the halfway point of the uterine cycle. Keep in mind, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle are two separate and distinct cycles.